for that statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank you for organizing today's meeting and also express our gratitude to the briefers who have been invited for their very interesting and useful information. In particular, I'd like to thank Razia Sultana for the very interesting information in her briefing, and I very much hope that in the course of the upcoming trip to Myanmar by members of the Security Council, will be taking part in that delegation. We hope to be able to find out more about this topic. Now, in the course of the almost 10-year period since the Security Council has begun to take an active interest in the issue of sexual violence and conflict, a lot has been achieved. First of all, there is a broad recognition has been reached that sexual violence is a serious challenge rather than some sort of a collateral and secondary manifestation of separate, although unhealthy instincts which are compounded by a situation of armed conflict. There's no doubt for us that sexual violence is a consequence of conflict, including due to the impunity of those who commit such crimes, which is why to fully put an end to put an end to sexual violence once and for all and all other types of violence against civilians can only be done by resolving armed conflicts through peaceful means and in eradicating their root causes. Traditionally, we have supported the work of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on sexual violence and conflict. In particular, we highly value your work aimed at strengthening national capacity, developing dialogue with religious and other traditional leaders, in dealing with the problem of the stigmatization of victims of sexual violence and their rehabilitation. Unfortunately, it has not been possible so far to defeat the evil of violence, and particularly we're concerned about information about the increase in the number of crimes pertaining to sexual violence by members of terrorist groups. We call on states to cooperate more actively in dismantling the so-called shadow economy of ISIL, which makes profits by, for example, being involved in trafficking of people and sexual slavery. We hope that these crimes will be effectively documented and investigated, and of course this falls within the remit of the authorities of the states where those crimes are committed, first and foremost. Mr. President, we'd also like to focus on a number of separate provisions contained in today's report. Although we share most of its recommendations and conclusions, I would like to draw your attention to a number of alarming aspects. First of all, just as a general comment, to effectively achieve the goals set for the special representative of the Secretary General, Madam Patton, she should strictly adhere to her mandate. She should not distract or dilute her efforts and resources in dealing with the issue of gender equality as a whole, or with migration and violence against women per se. That doesn't mean that these problems aren't important. They are, but they are not reflected in her mandate. The focus of attention should be the situations of armed conflict, and in particular those where sexual violence has acquired a particularly mass character. Now, also, it's not the first time we're seriously concerned by attempts to broadly interpret the scope of the mandate of the Security Council in combating sexual violence and conflict. By using another term, that is conflict-related sexual violence. Now, as we see it, what may at first sight seem to be a simple technical inconsistency. In fact, this threatens having the Security Council stray from its main terms of reference and interfere in the mandate of other UN bodies. It's important to strictly delineate sexual violence as a military crime, a war crime, and similar crimes of a more general nature. We'd also like to comment on another trend, and that is the increasing shift in focus in the report on human rights issues. We'd like to just remind you that sexual violence and conflict is first and foremost a violation of international humanitarian law. This is precisely why not only government structures, but non-government participants of armed conflicts are duty-bound to comply with norms aimed at to combat sexual violence. And we should monitor this on a systemic basis. And lastly, what's most important, this year, there are what we're seeing is unhealthy attempts to use the issue of sexual violence and conflict to further narrow political aims. And this in particular was reflected in the country section of the report. In particular, in the chapter on Syria, the issue of crimes by ISIL fighters and by other terrorist organizations is kind of barely mentioned. The evaluations and the figures are shown in such a way that you need to extrapolate in order to get the full picture. How should we interpret this? How will the fighters and terrorists react to this lack of courage? Might they not think that their crimes are actually escaping the attention of the international community and that they can continue? At the same time, not a word is mentioned about the significant change in the security situation in Syria as a whole, and the fact that most of the territory of the country has been cleansed of terrorists, or the fact that due to the complex and thorough work, a large, significant number of peaceful civilians have been freed from the hands of the fighters, and a significant share of that civilian population are women and children, including those who were victims of sexual violence and abuse. For example, just in the territory of eastern Ghouta during the most active phase of fighting, some 165,000 people have been liberated. We're convinced that an approach that is too biased, or where objective realities are not mentioned in the report, all this will only undermine the work of the special representative and lower the effectiveness of her work in combating sexual violence in conflict. Mr. President, also, we'd like to underscore separately that the policy of zero tolerance, which is welcomed in the report, should not be applied based on the principle of ours and theirs. It is unacceptable that that national peacekeeping contingents that are acting under UN mandate should be freed of their responsibility for committing certain actions, or those who are working, or representatives of NGOs working in certain countries. We would like to just recall in this connection that Paris has kind of tried to sweep under the carpet the examination of cases of sexual violence, including violence against children by French soldiers during the conduct of the operation of Sangaris in the Central African Republic. In spite of the fact that the investigation was supposedly carried out, based on all reports, no one was punished. This can only cause outrage. There are also other cases where the policy of double standards is applied. For example, in considering the draft resolution on extending the mandate of the United Nations mission in support of justice in Haiti, the delegation of the United States refused to enshrine the need to report on all accusations of sexual violence by NGOs that are representatives of NGOs that are accredited with the United Nations. Mr. President, in conclusion, I would like to state that we are not losing hope that the measures adopted in the UN, including debates such as the one today, will contribute to the goal of the elimination of sexual and all other forms of violence against civilians in the course of armed conflict, and ultimately will contribute to resolving conflicts for the benefit of international peace and security. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for that statement.